Hello and welcome to my presentation of my product for Component 2 of the Production Project module. I hope you enjoy. I wanted to begin this presentation by showing you the product, followed by a breakdown of the process that I went through to create the final piece. So that was my product. I'm now going to speak about my initial plan for this module and the pipeline I followed. My plan for this module was to create a cyberpunk/futuristic digital environment through camera projection. I wanted to add neon lights, TV screens on the buildings like those found in Times Square or Piccadilly Circus, and to add some live action footage of a person looking out of their window onto the scene. I started by following the plan of action found on the VLE, as well as creating my own production pipeline so that I could have a weekly achievement/goal of what I wanted to have complete by the end of each week, and also have a clear layout of what steps needed to be taken to achieve the desired product. So the first step was to create the matte painting. This image was the initial matte painting I created. I was happy with the outcome of this painting as I believe it immediately conveys the theme of a cyberpunk environment with the use of buildings that have bright lights and neon signs. That being said, some problems did arise with the perspective and the cleanup of some of the buildings. For example, this building started off with a man outside of it which needed to be removed. This caused some repetition to occur. I also wanted the scene to be more of an alleyway shot, therefore I decided to change the painting and created the following piece. I liked this shot a lot more, and even though it didn't immediately scream cyberpunk, I knew I could add additional assets to it to get it where I wanted it to be. I therefore decided to pursue this painting for the product. I was now ready to create the 3D geometry that the painting would be projected onto, as well as create the camera move I wanted for the shot. To do this, I created a camera in Maya and aligned it to the perspective of the painting by using the painting as an image plane. Once aligned, I created the geometry and camera move. Now in Nuke, I created my first test projection. As the camera movement pulled out into the scene, I knew the best projection method would be nested projection. I created my first test by projecting the painting from the final frame and then played through the sequence to see where I needed to add more projection cameras. After reviewing the sequence, I chose 4 frames to project from: frame 1, frame 100, frame 200 and frame 300. Now rendering the geometry of each of these frames as JPEGs, I went back into Photoshop to begin creating the artwork for these frames, making sure that it was double the resolution of my final output of 1920 by 1080. Now that the 4 frames were projecting onto the geometry, I reviewed the footage to identify where patching needed to be applied, and as you can see, a lot of texture stretching and doubling occurred which needed to be addressed. After identifying where this needed to happen, I took these frames into Photoshop and created the patches. This fixed most of the issues, however I was having particular problems with the front 2 buildings, and after trying different methods to fix them such as overscanning and patching, I decided to project the painting from a front orthographical camera. This helped immensely as it removed most of the problems such as doubling, textures, and with a few patches the buildings looked much better. Now I moved on to rendering out some passes. The first pass I knew I wanted to render out of Maya was an ambient occlusion pass, as this pass would add depth to the scene. I also received feedback that a depth pass would be beneficial to the scene as it helps dilute the colours further back in the scene, which would make the scene seem more realistic. For the lights, I created them in Maya initially but had trouble rendering them out. I therefore decided to create them in Nuke, with this being the outcome. After receiving feedback on how using Maya lights can allow me to have much more control over the scene, I went back into Maya and attempted to render out the lights again. Fortunately, this time worked and each light was rendered. Then in Nuke, I manipulated the colours and intensity of the lights. Now was the time to add additional elements to bring the sequence to life. The first thing I added was some neon signs. I rendered these out of Maya using the plugin RenderMan, which allowed me to turn geometry into mesh lights. To add the flicker to the signs, I manipulated the grade intensity and the merge mix. I then used the curve tool to track these light changes and link these attributes with the main lights via an expression. Next, I created the TV screens. I exported planes out of Maya in the correct positions and then projected videos onto them. To make the screens look more like LED screens, before projecting them I took them into After Effects and added some grids and colour corrections to reflect LED properties. The final step was to create the rain. To do this I used the Nuke plugin and just manipulated the size, speed and colour of the droplets. Now I'm going to discuss my individual development portfolio. To keep up with my initial plan and pipeline, I made sure I worked on the product every week and actively sought feedback. I kept a log of all the feedback I received each week, and this is a copy of my notes from each week. I tried to implement all feedback I received in order to create the best product possible. An example of some feedback that I took on board involves the geometry and how detailed it is. Initially I had very basic geometry and I was informed that by creating a few recesses, edge loops and extruding the geometry it would add more depth and realism to the scene. I am extremely happy I took this advice, as the result of doing so made aspects of the scene such as the windows look more realistic, as the art being projected correlated the shape and depth of the real world. This is a quick run through of my iterative development and the tests I conducted throughout this module. I believe I worked well throughout this module. I think my final product represents my initial idea well and it portrays all the fundamental aspects I wanted it to represent by the end of the module. I think I followed my pipeline and my plan of action well, but I do believe I didn't think that the projection phase would take as long as it did due to all the patching and doubling problems that occurred, and I spent longer than anticipated on this phase. The rendering of the passes and neon signs also took longer than expected. So if I was to have a do-over per se, I would definitely make sure I put aside a good chunk of time for these phases. I would also broaden the audience for my feedback. I relied solely on feedback from the online sessions, and although this feedback did provide rich and effective suggestions, by seeking even more I believe the product would have been even more dynamic. I would also like to thank everyone who gave me feedback and suggestions, as without these I don't think my product would be as elevated as it is, so thank you. In the future, to further develop the product and add further elements of interest, I would like to add the live action footage that I originally planned to include, as well as perhaps someone walking along the street, as I believe this would elevate the sequence a lot further. This concludes my presentation. I would like to end with showing the product once more. Thank you for watching and I hope you enjoy.